Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Friday Transportation Seminar. I am Dr. Jennifer Dill. I am the Director of the Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University, and I will be introducing and moderating today's seminar. Our Friday transportation seminars have been a tradition since the year 2000. These seminars are usually held live on the Portland State University's urban campus that is located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, and the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced on the indigenous ancestors of this place, remember these communities, and honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, today's seminar is obviously hosted fully online. Today, we are very pleased to have Dr. Kimberly Kahn, George Stern, and Peter Kuntz present on how pedestrian race and gender can influence drivers' behavior in interactions with pedestrians at crosswalks. Kimberly Barsamian Kahn is an associate professor of social psychology at Portland State University. She holds a PhD in social psychology from UCLA, and her research focuses on contemporary forms of subtle bias and prejudice. Within transportation contexts, she has focused on bias in intermodal interactions between drivers, pedestrians, and bicyclists. George Stern is a deaf-blind food writer, linguist, and disability rights advocate residing in Lubbock, Texas. He holds a BA in French from Texas Tech University and serves as the president of Deaf-Blind Citizens in Action and a board member for the Collaboration and Assistive Technology for Students with Sensory Impairments program at Texas Tech. Peter Kuntz manages the City of Portland Bureau of Transportation Signals, Street Lighting, and ITS division. He has served as an adjunct professor at Portland State University, teaching graduate courses in transportation engineering, and is active with many professional transportation engineering societies. Before jumping into today's seminar, I do want to let you know about some of our upcoming seminars. And I am waiting for the next slide. All right, so we have a couple exciting ones coming up. One about some research that Portland State University researchers have done in collaboration with the City of Portland, an evaluation of a transportation incentive program for affordable housing residents. And then later on in May, we have an alum of PSU, Dr. Stephen Howland, who's going to be talking about his dissertation about gentrification and transportation and social support for Black working poor families in Portland. So I hope that some of you can join us for those too. So as an overview of today's seminar, you can expect that our speakers will be presenting for about 45 minutes, followed by Q&A. We will be receiving questions through the questions feature on your control panel, and we will ask them. I will be doing the question asking at the end of the presentation, but feel free to type those in all along the way. If we run out of time for your questions, we will share them with the speakers afterwards if there's anything left that we need to follow up on. We are, as you noticed, recording today's seminar. It will be available on the TREC website later today, along with the presentation slides, so you can watch it again and share it with your friends and colleagues. And if you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. So with that, I am going to hand it over first to Dr. Kahn. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much for that introduction, Dr. Dill, and happy to be here and talk with you guys today about a program of research I've done looking at subtle bias in driver yielding behavior at crosswalks. I'd like to first acknowledge my excellent collaborators as part of this research team, both Dr. Tara Goddard and Dr. Arlie Atkins, who are PhDs in urban planning and at different universities now, and my former PhD student, Dr. Jean McMahon, who is now at the CDC. So we know that pedestrians are particularly vulnerable at crossing the street. And so their experiences at crosswalks represent an important safety concern. It's one potential point of conflict that they can have with drivers that can potentially lead to increased pedestrian fatalities. When we look at data from the CDC and other locations, racial minorities tend to be overrepresented in pedestrian fatalities. And this occurs even after we control for things like urban environment or any kind of related factors. There still tends to be a disproportionate amount of racial minorities being killed as pedestrians. So this led us to think about if racial minorities are potentially being treated differently by drivers at crosswalks. Is there something in their experiences as pedestrians and at crosswalks in particular that might be contributing to this overrepresentation in pedestrian fatalities? Some of our previous research that's out there has looked at this differential treatment of pedestrians by different demographic and social group characteristics. We've seen in previous research that high status cars are less likely to yield at crosswalks than low status cars. People are less likely to yield, are more likely to yield to people in their own age group, and are more likely to yield to disabled individuals at crosswalks. So we do see that there's some sort of differential treatment that's happening based on these identity characteristics. So this led us to think about race and what we might see, particularly when we're looking at driver-pedestrian interactions, that these interactions might reflect implicit biases and subtle forms of discrimination. Implicit biases are particularly influential when there are fast-paced decisions, when there's a lot of ambiguity or discretion in your behavior, and when there's distraction involved. And so those are all the things that drivers might be experiencing when encountering a pedestrian at a crosswalk. And so we might see implicit attitudes or implicit biases particularly influential in their behavior and decisions to stop or yield for pedestrians at crosswalks. So we tested this idea in a series of studies looking at drivers' treatment of pedestrians by race. And we did this using controlled field experiments. The first one was in downtown Portland at a 2-lane one-way street that was downstream from a stoplight. The crosswalk we looked at was a marked zebra stripe crossing pattern. And we did this study on off-peak hours, so there was no backed up traffic, both in the morning and afternoon, and only on days where there was clear visibility and the weather was okay. We had a team of pedestrians that were 3 white males, 3 black males, and they were all around 20 years old. We standardized their appearance, so they wore the same outfits. They were all similar build and height. And we trained them in a crossing procedure to approach the crosswalk, indicate their intention to cross in the same standardized way. We then had trained coders record the outcomes of these crossing trials and looking at the driver's behavior. Did a driver stop or not? And how long did it take for, how many drivers passed? And how long did it take until the pedestrian was able to safely cross in the crosswalk? Each trial began when the first car from a traffic light changed and hit a designated spot. So they all sort of started at the same temporal time and location. Pedestrians approached the edge of the crosswalk with their body faced out towards the cars, indicating their intention to cross the street. And the trial ended then when a car clearly yielded, or the entire platoon of cars from that stoplight passed without yielding, and then the next platoon was held up at the crosswalk, at the stoplight downstream. Pedestrians crossed and then individually, and then the next one was queued to start approaching the crosswalk when the other pedestrian was out of sight. Pedestrians were given a randomized order and then crossed individually. So here's just an image from that study, and you can see the pedestrian crossing the street here where the cars had clearly yielded. So our results from the first study, we saw that on average, when we summed up these trials, Black pedestrians were passed by more than twice as many cars compared to our white pedestrians. And when we looked at the total amount of time it took until a car yielded and they were able to cross the street, our Black pedestrians waited about 32% longer on each trial until a car yielded and they were able to cross. We followed this initial study up with 2 additional studies where we were able to replicate and expand this effect. We did a similar experimental design here at a new location in 2 different times. It was a similar 2-lane one-way road, and we were able to do this once before and after the city marked a particular intersection with a crosswalk. So we could look at what were the yielding rates in an unmarked intersection, and then after that same intersection received markings. We also added in gender as a variable to examine, and so we could look at the interaction of both race and gender on drivers' yielding behavior. We had 12 pedestrians in these studies, 3 Black men, 3 white men, 3 Black women, and 3 white women. And here again, you can see an image of what this looked like. About 300 trials in study 2 and about 400 different driver trials in study 3. So at the unmarked crosswalk, and this was just an intersection, but an unmarked crosswalk, we saw that overall the stopping rates were incredibly low. Only about 2.8% of the first cars stopped for any waiting pedestrian, even though in Oregon, every intersection is a legal crosswalk. And when we looked here at were there any differences by the race or gender of the pedestrians, we basically did not see any differences here. And essentially it's because drivers didn't stop for anyone. They were pretty universal in not stopping. So we didn't see bias here. Now we were able then to replicate this same study at that same crosswalk after it had now received markings, a traditional zebra marking pattern. Here we saw now about 55% of first cars stop in those after the crosswalk had received markings. Here's a little bit of our data and our findings from this study. We do see bias here. In general, we saw that cars were more likely to stop for whites compared to Blacks. They were more likely to stop for females compared to males. And when we look at the differences between race and gender, cars were most likely to stop for white women and least likely to stop for Black men. When we look at the number of cars that passed without yielding, Black men had more cars passed compared to Black women. So we again see Black men being subjected to the most discrimination here. We also looked at the stop bar that was now painted on the road, and we coded where the car stopped when they did yield. Did they stop before the indicated stop bar? Were they obeying the signage, they're providing more space for the pedestrian to cross? Or did they stop after the bar? So they're actually closer to the pedestrian and infringing on their crossing space. Here again, we saw race and gender differences. For both Black males and Black females, they were more likely to stop after the bar, so closer and infringing on the crossing space of the pedestrian. Where for white males and white females, cars were more likely to stop before the bar. So they were stopping further back and providing them more space. We also ran a series of focus groups with Black pedestrians in Portland about these ideas and these themes. And we saw that they reported a lot of interactions with drivers that they thought were affected by race. One example quote from one of our participants: "I will come to an intersection on one side and waiting because there's cars. And then as soon as a white person steps on the other side, oh, a car stops. I'm like, this is magic. What's going on? It was you, it wasn't me." They also then noted the stress caused by these interactions with drivers. "I think it's stressful. It's just an added stress to your commute. Whenever, even when it's a leisurely commute, stuff like that. It's just like you have to know, I guess, just part of the Black experience of being more aware and cautious of everything that we do." So overall, what we've seen in this line of research is that in general, marking crosswalks is effective at increasing stopping, but we also see that it's being done unequitably based on an individual's pedestrian's race and gender. Reducing perceived discretion in stopping may increase stopping rates for all pedestrians. So one thing we are interested in looking at further is things like additional signage or flashing lights, or making it more obvious for drivers that they need to stop regardless, and that might help reduce some of these biases. But I think this data in general speaks to the importance of considering equity when thinking about transportation and urban planning and design. So with that, I will pause and continue on, pass on to our next presenter, which I believe is going to be George.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Kimberly. I actually, that was an impressive presentation because I didn't know a lot of this in terms of the difference in reaction in the amount of crossing space that was even left for pedestrians of different genders and different races. So that was a nuance I hadn't heard before. My name is George Stern, and I, as the introduction said, I'm president of Deafblind Citizens in Action. And my portion of it is going to be less about data per se and more about lived experience as a deafblind, visibly Black and male person who has moved through the world as a pedestrian, as a user of public transit. And before we get started, I want to leave you guys with this quotation of Toni Morrison's. I think it's from her book, A Mercy. It says, those limited to walking everywhere are condemned never to get anywhere. And I think I'm going to return to it later on in the presentation, but I think it's telling in terms of what Kimberly was just talking about, in terms of the stress, in terms of the aggravation of being a pedestrian, and particularly a pedestrian of a highly discriminated against class of people in a society where generally, higher class, higher status people are not pedestrians, they're drivers. So this will be relevant later on in the presentation. I grew up in South Florida, If y'all know anything about South Florida, it's not a good place to be a pedestrian at all. Just don't try. You can be a pedestrian on the beach if you want, but elsewhere, don't. Too many New Yorkers come down with their crazy ways. And too many South Floridians are born there with their crazy ways of driving. There's no yielding for the human body that wants to cross the street generally. So as a deaf-blind person, in order to travel independently, required a service called orientation and mobility. And I got a lot of orientation and mobility in my school system. So, learning how to walk from classroom to classroom independently using my white cane, which is the identifying symbol and method of safe navigation for blind people. And I didn't really begin learning how to independently navigate my community, as in like crossing streets and so on, until I was 17 years old. And this was due to a combination of parental fear and my own fear. Like how am I going to do this really as a deafblind person? Because generally what happens is they teach blind people to rely very heavily on their hearing. Well, for me, I couldn't really do that because I'm deafblind. My hearing is not the rock, the super hearing that they would normally train a blind person to depend on. And so eventually, as I said, at 17, I started taking these O&M lessons. And, a lot of my worries were confirmed. I was only able to judge what traffic was doing safely about 70% of the time or 60% of the time. The rest of the time, if I'd crossed, I would be dead. And so we decided, it wasn't necessarily the best thing in that place for me to have to cross streets very often. And this was also the time at which I decided, the safer thing for me to do really would be to get a dog guide, which I ended up doing. And getting a dog guide really upped my confidence in terms of travel, in terms of even risking crossing streets, because I knew that if I judged wrongly, I could count on the dog's senses to, say, oh, no, we're going to stop because actually there is a car. Or even if I chose correctly, and the car chose not to yield, the dog would react in time and in a way that my hearing could not have me react. So once I got the dog guide, I still didn't really up my travel so much in Florida because, again, South Florida is just not the place to be a pedestrian. Dog guide, super hearing or no. But I ended up moving from South Florida for college. I came to Texas. And this is an interesting wrinkle for me. I lived in two cities in Texas, Austin and Lubbock, where I attended TTU. But the interesting wrinkle for me as someone transitioning from one state to the other is that I was also transitioning body states. I went from being a pretty, shall we say, slender, clean cut, kind of, how would I say, harmless looking Black male figure stereotype to being more bulked out. As they say, everything's bigger in Texas. Well, one of those things was me. And so, I've gotten into judo and gotten into doing some other things. And so I was bulking out and I was getting descriptors like, oh, you look like a tank, or, oh, you look like a football player. And so what this translated to, I think, and it's hard for me to tell because, again, I'm depending on my hearing to tell me what drivers are doing, if they're yielding when they should, etc. But what it seemed to translate into was I went from a state of drivers being kind of more hesitant towards me, being more permissive, and to drivers just kind of being like, okay, fine, I'll just go. You can wait. so they started treating me very much more along the lines of what Kimberly was reporting, in terms of really crowding my crossing space, in terms of just going because, as far as they were concerned, my time was not valuable enough for them to stop. And so that was something I noticed that paralleled my change in body type, again, from this more genteel, delicate Black male figure to kind of a more possibly threatening, bigger Black male figure. And this is something, that I particularly noticed in Austin, Texas, in Lubbock, Texas, when I noticed it. It's now the other wrinkle with that, of course, though, is having a dog guide. And I'd be curious to see if you can ever get enough blind pedestrians together for a study like this, how people yield to a cane user of a specific race versus a dog guide user of a specific race. Because I live in Texas, and it's a place that people sometimes, they really love their dog. Let's just put it that way. And so when my dog is particularly visible, my first dog guide was a black lab, and so sometimes not very visible, but with the harness on, he was more visible. And so sometimes I feel like cars would yield more to that than even to me. And seeing me and the dog, black person plus dog, would almost be okay, let's actually stop, give them more space, give them more leeway, and so that was almost a positive impact, a positive, it encouraged more positive behavior towards me having the dog. Whereas sometimes with the cane, I've heard reports that people just don't care. They see the white cane, they see you stepping out, and they just don't care. And I've heard no few of my blind friends talk about canes getting broken. And of course, there are the very, very tragic cases of dog guides users and their guides being injured and sometimes killed by drivers refusing to yield. And so I don't want to discount those at all, but I would be curious to see what studies showed in the difference in drivers' reactions to dog users versus cane users. So in all the other cities I've been to, and this is getting back to my point about Toni Morrison, one of the greatest memories I have is of being in New York for 2 weeks, New York City. First time I went to New York City, I hated it. I thought it was too crowded. I was a boy coming from South Florida, and we're used to our space, and we're not used to that many people outside of either high school rush hour or a mall, right? But New York City, the second time I went, I understood, I appreciated the fact that this was a place where Toni Morrison's maxim of whoever is limited to walking everywhere cannot get anywhere, it doesn't apply in New York City. And frankly, it doesn't apply anywhere else where this class distinction between pedestrian and non-pedestrian doesn't exist as much. Her statement is more true because of the class distinction than it is because of the nature of walking. When you go to New York, everybody, even the most important of people, you can be Barack Obama, you can be a celebrity, you can be whoever, you're gonna walk. It just makes more sense in the way the city is designed, in the way the culture is designed for you to walk than it does for you to drive your car, right? And so one of my advocacy points as president of Deafblind Citizens in Action really is to encourage cities to make that shift. Make the shift away from car centrism, away from driver centrism, and toward pedestrian centrism, which ultimately, frankly, I think is benefiting everyone. It feeds into the concept of universal design. And so that's really been one of my main advocacy and our main advocacy points as Deafblind Citizens in Action. Now, I'll leave you guys with this last bit. One of the things I like to really talk to people about is this difference between perceived utility and actual utility. When people talk, a lot of people have said to me when I ask them how a place is, like, oh yeah, it's walkable. That's very easy for you to say if you actually spend most of your travel time in a car, right? And so when I go through and I'm looking for an apartment as a blind or deafblind person who wants to move to a new city, and I'm looking at these walkability scores, I'm really taking them with a grain of salt, right? Unless they qualify, oh, yeah, we actually know that this walking score is true because, and here's a breakdown of drivers versus pedestrians versus public transit users to prove our point. So I actually applaud that more websites and more people and more universities are starting to take things like this into consideration. And I just hope that we keep pushing forward with this and ultimately get to a point where we're truly committedly dealing with universal design. With that, we'll hand it over to Peter, I believe.
All right, thank you, George. That was great. I really appreciate your perspectives and your lived experience. That was, so I think it's as engineers, I think we often we spend our time looking at the data and we don't talk to people like we should to really get that experience. So that was very powerful for thinking through what does our work really mean for people. I think Kimberly's presentation also touched on the human elements that we as engineers sometimes forget about. So as a city practitioner, one of the elements of this is, okay, what do we do with all this new information that we have available to us, and how might we, direct our efforts to make sure that we're analyzing equity within our work. So as a group of professionals at the city of Portland, we've really done a dive into street lighting and now just starting to get into crosswalks and where they're placed and understanding a little bit more about our community from a lens of how do we address equity as a part of our daily work. So I'll talk a little bit about that, give you a little history, talk just briefly about our strategic plan, and then get into the dashboard and some of the challenges that we have as professionals as we move forward, thinking about this in a new ways. The street lighting, from a history standpoint, I go back to the 1912 Greater Portland Plan, where it was declared that Portland is second to no city in the world in the matter of street lighting. So we've got a legacy of doing street lighting. I think in preparation for this, I think there was 1852, we were doing fish oil street lamps. So we've thought about this for a while. The picture on the right and from the 50s is, when we were doing mercury vapor street lighting. But we know from the history that there is a past of segregation and inequities within the work that government has done. So reading The Color of Law was really an eye-opener for me. So if you haven't picked that book up, boy, it's a fascinating perspective on what we have in terms of our history and how we need to think about undoing that in the future. And so there's been some really great work within Portland on an equity matrix that essentially informs our work. It's part of our citywide racial equity plan that says, let's identify based on census tract information the income and racial equity and racial makeup, and then that you can really dig deeply into who are we serving in each of these individual communities. Now, that this data is imperfect for sure, and you can argue, I'm sure Kimberly could argue a bit about those factors. I'll just say as engineers, it's our role to look at this and to listen and to try to apply this in our work, and that's what we've tried to do here. Our first effort in this was when we were doing a streetlight LED replacement program. We wrote a nice paper in the IT journal that was published a few years ago saying, really the most important thing is to measure where you're doing your work and how that affects the community. If you're going citywide with LEDs, you can monitor the progress, but you're touching every part of the city. So there's, the equity, maybe there's not the inequity because you're just replacing the existing streetlight bulbs. So that was kind of our first foray into this back, about 5 or 6 years ago now. And then the city went ahead with the PED PDX plan. If you haven't read that, the portion on walking while black, I think, talked a lot about the lived experience that you just heard from George, and even Kimberly mentioned this as well. So we've done some work on this. So okay, that's a plan. What's the engineer do with this? And the engineer reads it and says, "Oh gosh, look at this. When we ask people what makes walking difficult in Portland, and walking while black is the one column, and the general population is the other. Poor lighting comes up high is the notion of what's a problem of walking while black. Clearly, sidewalks and not having passed or missing on busy streets is important as well. And then safe places to cross busy streets is also there as well. So, that's a lot of the work that the signals and street lighting team does. And so that was an eye opener for us. Another kind of shot in the arm, if you will, to wake up and know that this has got to be a part of our work going forward. The strategic plan then reinforced that even more by saying one of the overarching questions we're going to ask ourselves when we do our work is, will our efforts advance equity and address structural racism? Again, a fantastic question, really leads to more deep introspection on what work we're doing. So part of the lion's share of our work is fixing streetlights that have been knocked down. That's just one example of our maintenance activity. And the good news is I'm very fortunate to work with some amazing individuals that spend their time to do just that. And we're very fortunate to have the support at the elected levels for building and making sure that we can keep the lights on for you. And so that streetlight, the aspect of this is, if you can think about how quickly are we responding to these knockdowns, and is that done equitably? So when we think about the questions that we can ask, we can say is our response time influenced by the location? Are we delivering this service equitably? And the question you could also ask yourself is, well, gosh, Peter, this seems like something that the city should be doing already. Why aren't cities doing this already? Well, oftentimes our records for maintenance is in paper, and that's hard to get into electronic format that you can analyze through GIS. The good news is for Portland, we've done just that. And so this streetlight response program is something that we're now tracking. So every action that's happening is digitized. We have a location. We can look at the equity as a backdrop to our work and use that to ensure that we have accountability and we're able to communicate and evaluate our results. So by applying all the functional elements of the things that we do in streetlight maintenance, we now have a way in which to overlay that with an equity score and using the racial equity toolkit to determine what repair and what action is next. So we've done that. The report here summarizes our new street lighting equity analysis dashboard. So this is very new. It's always great to have Portland State invite you to present so that you can stimulate an action, and really this is the result of hard work of our GIS team. So I have to thank my colleagues at PBOT, from Charles Radosta, who leads the engineering team, to Joe Nielsen, who's the master of GIS. We're very fortunate to have such wonderful staff to work with here. But you can see this provides us with an idea of, we are completing a lot of responses. We have an average response time. You can argue, gosh, can't you drive that response time down, Peter? Isn't it just easy as replacing a light? And the answer is, well, no, it's a little more difficult than that. So with this dashboard now, we can ask questions of our entire city. If we look over the entire city, are our highest equity score areas, so the areas where there's lower income and higher diversity, are those areas, are those people being served slower on average? And as an engineer who had never had access at this level and this transparency, I was a little worried about what our answer would be. And so the good news is when we compared the highest 6 through 10, the highest scores of equity, our average equity score there is 7.8. And the response time for those for the basically the last 2.5 years is about 27 days. So, just replacing the street light that's out on your street, yeah, that takes just a few days. But a knockdown of a pole or something more significant, some more significant damage takes a lot longer. So on the higher equity scores, we're at 27 days. On the lower equity scores, so the areas that are more affluent, less racial diversity, we're actually performing poorly, more poorly than the other. So 40 days for average response time. So this level of data really presents us a way in which to start to dig into whether we're performing as we would hope. So there's just another summary of that. So you can see that the higher equity scores actually get a reasonably good response time. We can get into the data. I mean, there's a lot of issues. The census tract, the age of the infrastructure, some of our oldest infrastructures in some of the oldest parts of town that are maybe the more affluent parts of town. There's a lot of issues there. So that's just the start of the conversation we have. We can ask a lot of other questions, whether ornamental streetlights, the expense of that ornamental streetlight is worth the investment. Are we putting those street lighting investments in the more affluent areas? And are those equitably distributed? Because we know the cost of those streetlights, it's more expensive to have that fancier design, and a wood pole with streetlight delivers more equity. We can do more with less money. So these are the sorts of questions that we're asking as we go forward. So a few bright ideas for street lighting. We can innovate to reduce costs. I mean, that's what we've done with the LED streetlights. We asked developers to play a role. But really at the heart of this from an equity standpoint is we want to measure what matters, and we're really getting to that with this new dashboard. I wanted to extend this just quickly to crosswalks. As we think of this as, again, a brand new dashboard that we've looked at, we've coded all the locations where we have markings. So we've got a whole host of ideas for Kimberly's next research problem statement with over 2,200 marked crosswalks, 135 new red flash beacons with many more on the way, and then of course traffic signals. And so, the question you can ask is, are those intersection treatments, are those equitable? And the average equity score, if I look at that, is 6.3. So you could argue, well, that's not terrible. It's not that we're always in the highest income areas, but certainly as we move forward, is that equity score going to increase? Is a question we could ask. If I do a quick case study around Portland State, Portland State looks wonderful in terms of the number of crosswalks that are there. The coverage is very good. And so we're doing quite well near Portland State. If I dig in a little deeper and just look at where we have unmarked and just only marking, there's another look you can have on what's there. And then of course, again, in identifying where there are opportunities, again, Portland State ranks pretty high in terms of crosswalk coverage. It's also a very high equity score, which is interesting to think about. Is this really a high equity score? I mean, I think about the students, that obviously brings the population, the income down, and maybe it's more racially diverse than the rest of Portland. If I think about the suburbs though, 122nd Avenue comes to mind, and you think about the nature of the crossings out there and where we've put our RFBs and the PED signals, that equity score goes up a little bit. And then we also know that the locations and the density of crossings is quite a bit lower. And this is where I'll just say this is brand new. So one of the aspects of this that we have to rectify is that we don't have ODOT's crossings. This is very focused on the city of Portland and isn't comprehensive. So we have some work to do to clean up this data. So while I present this, it's still a bit in draft form. So there's some issues there with crosswalk data. The good news is we now have a new tool with this dashboard to really get into whether there's historic inequities in crosswalk requests and where we've made investments over time. And then in the future, we'll be able to make a very careful look at the next year and say, are the investments we're making, are they going to be addressing the areas that have the highest need? So with that, hopefully I gave you a little insights to what Portland's doing, and I'm happy to, I'm looking forward to the question and answers.
Wow. I have to say this is, I think, one of my favorite Friday transportation seminars, and we've had some good ones, but all three speakers, I really want to thank you. Everything complemented, the presentations complemented each other very well. We have some questions already lined up, but I encourage you to ideally put the questions in the Q&A box, because that's what I'm going to be focusing on in terms of answering. I know there's a few over in the chat. So the first few questions that came in were based on Professor Khan's presentation, so have to do with the research. So I'll start with those, and then we'll get into some of the other parts of the presentations. Couple questions for Dr. Khan about whether or not you collected any information about the drivers and sort of the role of the drivers, either race, gender, et cetera, and how that might be influencing things.
Thanks so much for that question. And I didn't have time to go into all of the details, but yes, we did attempt as best we could. We had a coder that was positioned discreetly in the field, looking at the driver and coding their race or gender. And we coded if it was possible, or if it was too quick and they weren't able to do that, of the car that stopped. And we did not see any differences by driver gender. That did not influence anything. So both men and women were equally likely to display these patterns, which is very consistent with what we see about implicit attitudes in general. Both men and women hold implicit attitudes. And we didn't have enough minority drivers. I think we ended up with, it was about 15%, I want to say. That we had, so it just wasn't enough of a sample to be able to look at that. The majority of the drivers, both in downtown Portland and then in Southeast Portland, where the other area we conducted this study, were white, which matches in general the demographics of Portland. We'd love to be able to replicate and do these studies in primarily minority neighborhoods and see what kind of patterns we're finding there as well. We have not been able to do that yet.
And that actually, I'll just take all these research related questions together. That relates to another about sort of opportunities to replicate, looking at different ages and socioeconomic status. Because there was a specific question about having a study with a larger group of participants, such as N over 30 for each subgroup. But could you clarify, because while you had 3 of each of the 4 pedestrian types, I think the key factor would be the number of crossings, not the number of individuals, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great clarification and what goes into the research design. So we did have more than one. I needed 3 people representing each racial group, and that was so that we could see that there wasn't anything about one individual in particular that was driving these effects, and we saw similar yielding patterns across the individuals within those race and gender categories. And then we had each individual complete that crossing trial around 20 times, depending on which study it was. So in those last studies, we were looking at about 300 to 400 different crossing trials. So that's the number of different times that a participant went by, crossed in that section. So based on our statistical analyses, that's a large enough sample and with adequate power to see this pattern. But of course, being able to replicate this in different locations, with different groups as well, of course, looking at Latinx individuals, Asian Americans, those would also really be important follow-ups. And so we're hoping and excited to do some of that research. even though it sounds like it's a small study, this takes actually a huge amount of coordination for these studies. We had about 30 people out in the field over a month period. So they're actually big things to scale up and take significant, investment. So we're very thankful for Trek and NITSE for the funding for the studies that we talked about here, and hopeful that we'll be able to get additional funding to conduct some additional studies. We have seen, once these papers have been published, there is some additional work starting to come out. Las Vegas, for example, did a scaled down version of this and saw some similar patterns of discrimination there, as well as a couple other locations.
Yeah, and there's some additional, I'm going to move on to some other questions just because there are a lot and we have limited time, but there's some additional comments and questions on here about like the need for different age groups, particularly older adults as people crossing the street, and then questions about doing it under different lighting conditions, for example.
Absolutely,
So,
yeah, all great questions and all things we'd love to explore.
Great. So I'm going to ask our Trek team if they could unshare the slides so we can get all of our speakers on the screen. And I'm going to ask sort of a larger question that's come up a little bit in the chat and also in the discussion. I think it's pretty clear from the evidence that just having a crosswalk doesn't necessarily make it safe. And so I'd like to maybe hear from all of the speakers, like what more do we need to do? What are some additional action items to improve safety and to make it definitely more equitable? Maybe we'll start with Peter and then move to George, let's say.
Well, I guess, you're talking about my life's work. We are building a significant number of pedestrian hydrant beacons, half signals, and flash beacons to really increase the safety of these crossings. I think the key aspect there, is just the number and the limited resources. And for Georgia's benefit and others, we are taking the perspective that we have to make these work for people that are blind, and thinking about how that then provides accessibility that we just have never had before at some of these crossings. So the extent that we're willing to go is really we are thinking about universal access, especially at signalized and beaconed intersections.
This is George speaking. I think, firstly, in Kimberly's study, there was a marked difference, at least a marked change in behavior when intersections were marked versus unmarked. So that's the first step, and it's an obvious first step, right? It's like, if you don't know to change your behavior unless something is marked clearly, or at least it helps you change your behavior more if you are willing to do so. Now, the issue becomes then that willing to do so part of it. And, a lot of that, again, is going to depend on a culture shift. Because if the majority of people, particularly high status people, are in cars and they're thinking as people in cars, and cars have priority, then that's just how it's always going to be. You won't really start to see a change, a shift in culture, until the use of these crosswalks, the dependence on safety as a pedestrian, is something that everyone has to participate in. Everyone has to partake equally in. It's kind of like, again, let's use NYC as an example. Trains and schedules of trains wouldn't be so important if literally everyone from high class to low class didn't depend on them to an equal extent. And so I don't know. We're probably not going to see cars magically vanish overnight and everyone suddenly become a pedestrian. But definitely there has to be some similar shift in the culture that affects a similar kind of sea change. And I think, some of the infrastructure program investment, some of the thought processes that are changing at the municipal level, and some of the work that you guys are doing at Trek is definitely going to be a part of that.
So I'd love to hear from you, Dr. Khan, being a social psychologist with expertise in bias and implicit bias, because there's a lot of questions that have come up about the role of education and how do we counter these biases. So if you could speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So my expertise, I'm a social psychologist, is in stereotyping and prejudice in these non-conscious implicit forms. And, we know that one, implicit bias is incredibly pervasive. The majority of individuals in the United States hold some level of implicit bias. And so it's pervasive, and it's also incredibly difficult to change. First off, most people aren't even aware when they're doing these actions or how these implicit associations or stereotypes that they hold are influencing their behavior. And then it's not as simple as being able to magically get rid of them. So while there are interventions and ways we can slowly start to try to change people's implicit biases, we see they have to be really motivated and aware and sort of constantly working to sort of counter these implicit associations that they hold. There's, of course, that aspect, but we also want to think about then what is it in the environment or the infrastructure that is either facilitating or can help inhibit the expression of some of these biases. So we're thinking about intervention across both of those ideas, both from the infrastructure or situational context, as well as individual, change. So certainly media campaigns, awareness, this is definitely a good step. I don't think that it's going to take away everything. So I think it's going to be a multi-level and multi-pronged approach to try to reduce these biases. And so while I think it's fantastic the work that Peter's been doing in putting crosswalks and new infrastructure into underserved communities, what our research is saying is just having this infrastructure might actually not take away the biases in use. And so I think that's an additional level of analysis that you want to look at, is what's happening now after these new things are instituted across different communities.
Great, thank you. And I'm gonna ask one last question on here because we're almost out of time for Peter Kuntz about, so you gave us a great example of what PBOT is starting to do in this area with your dashboard. Are you seeing this being done in other cities, or how do we transfer this knowledge and expand the practice?
Yeah, great question. I haven't seen it done so much in other cities. I would say that, street lighting was our first foray into that. I think, street lighting is probably not my primary expertise, although it's really, it's really important. So while we've done some things, we haven't seen other work in the literature. I think from a traffic engineering perspective, equity is still a fairly new topic. We tend to focus on the nuts and bolts as opposed to the social sciences, and that's I think a key distinction that as when a weakness of our profession. We're so focused on getting to that hundredth of a decimal place of accuracy, and really sometimes missing the big picture.
And I think that's a good point to end it on, because I think what our group of speakers got to is, what is that bigger picture that we need to be thinking of? I know there's some unanswered questions, but we do want to end on time. And I want to remind everyone out there that we will post the recording of this, and the slides will be posted on our website a few hours after we end. And if you haven't signed up for our monthly newsletter, please do, so you can be aware of these events and our research. And also, I believe, I lost my script, I'm sorry, but I believe after you end here, you're going to get a short survey. We really do appreciate your feedback and appreciate the positive comments. I really want to thank our three speakers, Kimberly, George, and Peter, for an absolutely fantastic way to spend part of my Friday. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.